right, let's go ahead and get started. This is Bonnie McFarland, and welcome to our part 2 of our Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan meetings. Our last meeting was focused on the legal requirements outlined in SB 98. Since we didn't have a template or instructions available at that time, this time we plan to focus on the plan template that was released and the accompanying instructions. We also wanted to be prepared to respond to any questions you have, since we know a lot of you have participated in the CDE webinars on this topic. We sent out a survey last week. Unfortunately, we didn't get many responses, so we're guessing that one of three things: you either have no questions, or you're too confused to know what to ask, or you're too busy trying to meet deadlines to even think about asking questions. So we did get a few, and we embedded those responses in the presentation, and we also tried to anticipate some of the questions that you were having. Once again, our team is here today, and you'll hear from each of them in this order: Emi Tomamatsu, Adrienne Balcazar, Evan Bartelheim, Rachel Garcia, and Jeannie Keith. All right, next slide. We're in a little bit different format today, so the questions this time, rather than using a chat, will be in the Q&A. We'll monitor your questions and answer any we can, but we will send a written follow-up Q&A following this webinar to any questions, and we'll also contact CDE for any clarification on those that we don't have the answers to. All right, next. Okay, today's presentation, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the final template, which was released August 31st, and along with the final instructions. They've also, since the release of the instructions and the template, CDE has had 2 webinars, which hopefully have answered most of your questions. The slides and resources from our previous meetings are posted on our website, but we do have some additional resources for you. We previously provided the Learning Continuity Plan tool, the text and the annotated text of the law, and now 3 new items are a process checklist, a summary of legal checklist with summary of legal requirements, and LACO Services has provided a coordinated support guide, which is new. All right, next slide. Let's take a look at some of those. This is a copy of what's on our website, and this is a LACO support guide. It includes suggestions and resources for each section of the plan. So on one side, you'll see some general recommendations. On the right-hand side, you'll see a list of resources throughout LACO and outside of LACO to support you in addressing each area of the plan. And the links, many of the links go to recorded workshops or directly to resources that you can use. This is available on our main page of our LACO website. Okay, next slide. In addition to that, we have a couple new tools. At the request of superintendents, we've developed a checklist of legal requirements. This includes all the requirements required for each section of the plan in a checklist format, so you can review your plan prior to taking it to the board to make sure you've hit all the requirements. Okay, and then some of the tools that we've had previously. We had a planning tool, the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan planning tool, which provides suggestions for you, things to consider for each area in the plan. We also have a link to the text on our website, and then an annotated copy of SB 98, the section specifically addressing the plan requirements. In addition, on the next slide, the CDE webpage, you'll find the finalized template and the instructions. In addition, CDE has developed a list of frequently asked questions, and they're continually updating that with questions from the field. So a good spot to check periodically for new information and clarification. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the plan template. It includes 7 main sections, which are listed on this slide. In addition, there are other descriptions that are embedded in each of these major sections. We'll be reviewing these each section in depth today, but you can see the major sections. There's a general information section, one that has to do with stakeholder engagement. Continuity of learning is a significantly large section. You can see page 2 through 5, and then mental and social emotional well-being, pupil family engagement, school nutrition, and increased or improved services are the main sections of the template. Okay, next slide. Okay. You'll find the template in the template 4 different places with tables for identifying actions and associated budgeted expenditures. 3 of the tables are related to specific sections of the plan. So you'll find a table under actions related to in-person instruction, those related to distance learning, and actions related to learning loss. In addition, there's one other table that says additional actions. LEAs can include actions there and expenditures for those areas that aren't addressed in the other tables. In addition, LEAs can also add additional expenditure tables under each section if they wish. Okay, next. Okay. Funding in the plan. The action and expenditure tables include a column indicating the total amount of funds supporting the action, and a second column asking if any of the funds included are contributing to the increased or improved services requirements. And if so, how much of it is allocated to that. The tables ask for funding amounts only and do not include anywhere to indicate individual fund sources. However, it's important to keep in mind that all funds included in the plan must be used in accordance with the spending requirements for that program. So, for example, all ESSA programs have a supplement not supplant provision. Therefore, all ESSA funds included must be supplemental to expenditures from state and local funds. In addition, each ESSA program has its own requirements, and those requirements must be adhered to. Federal CARES funds, on the other hand, do not have a supplement not supplant requirement. However, those CARES funds included in the learning loss mitigation funds, and that includes the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds, the GEAR funds, and the Coronavirus Relief Funds that they refer to as CR funds. They must be used based on the defined use of funds found on the CDE website and any conditions attached to the legal assurances the district agreed to for receipt of those funds. So on the CD website, under learning loss mitigation, is a description of the use of funds, and then additionally, you as an LEA, in order to receive the funds, agreed to a list of assurances, and you should review those assurances, make sure they're spent in alignment with those requirements. The only dollar amount specified specifically in the plan that are identified is the amount allocated to meet the increased or improved services requirement. No other funding source and no other specific dollar amount is included. Okay, next. Excuse me. In addition to the template, the instructions include an introduction. There are instructions, okay? And as with the LCAP template, the recent one, as you'll recall, the instructions were critical to ensure all the elements of the plan are adequately addressed. Reading the template prompts isn't sufficient to meet the plan requirements. The prompts in the template are abbreviated descriptions for the reader. The instructions actually include the criteria for determining if the response is sufficient, and they also include related information and legal requirements that need to be considered. CDE has indicated that the plan should be developed with the full scope of SB 98 in mind, and some of the required descriptions in the plan are related to other sections of SB 98 that define or provide more detailed information regarding various requirements. The introduction on the next slide to the instructions provides the purpose for the plan and provides a rationale for some of the requirements and the timeline. The introduction indicates that the legislation was an attempt to balance the needs of stakeholders while streamlining the engagement process and condensing multiple plans. Next slide. As you recall, the governor's executive order required a written report to the community and also required a one-year LCAP that was supposed to be due on December 15th. The goal of SB 98 was to create a plan that combined the LCAP requirement with districts and charter schools' needs to plan for the upcoming year under COVID. So as they developed the legislation, they were looking, how do we address these two challenges that districts have and these two required plans? How do we pull those together and put them into one plan? All right, next slide. So the continuity plan replaced the LCAP for 2021 and superseded the requirements in the governor's order. And the plan is intended to actually memorialize or capture the planning process that you're already doing right now. So they're understanding that you've been planning for some time now. Conversations have been taking place about how to open school, what you're going to be doing. And this plan is an opportunity to capture all of that planning into one document. Okay. It's a very comprehensive plan, as you know, and it describes how the LEA is going to accomplish all of these tasks, how you're addressing gaps in learning, how you're conducting meaningful stakeholder engagement, and maintaining transparency with all stakeholder groups, how you're addressing the unique needs of various students, your unduplicated pupil groups, and other students with unique needs, including students experiencing homelessness, how you're providing access to necessary devices and connectivity for distance learning for all students, how you're providing resources and supports to address the well-being, mental health of both students and staff, and how you're continuing to provide school meals for students. Next. Everyone recognizes what a short timeline this is for this big task. However, it does provide more time than would have been available had LEAs been required to submit a June 30th LCAP in the midst of closing schools and getting ready for a new year. And it provides a plan for the school year, which a December LCAP would not have done. It would have been halfway through the school year before you had anything to show the plan. So this actually is a compromise in terms of the timeline, not as early as the LCAP, but not halfway through the year as the one-year LCAP would have been. All right, next slide. Just some additional information. First of all, just a reminder, all LEAs, school districts, county offices, charter schools, all are required to complete the learning continuity plan. CD has indicated there is no requirement to use the state template. Okay, this is not a board-approved template, and so the state developed it, but there's no requirement to use the template. However, all the legally required descriptions that are embedded in the template need to be included in the plan. So using the template will help you meet those requirements, but if you have some other plan that you feel meets all those, you can use it. School districts are also, can also contact our office. We're here to help you. If districts have an assigned LCAP coordinator, then contact them with questions, or if you want us to take a look at your plan before you take it to your board for approval, contact either your LCAP coordinator or send an email to the LCAP email list, and we'll be happy to review it informally. Please provide us at least a week for a response. As you know, they're big plans and we want to give you the best response we can. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Amy now to review the plan development and submission process.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. We're going to be going over each area of the learning continuity plan, but first we're going to start with sharing one of the new resources we've developed to assist LEAs in their planning and to check off all the necessary process-related requirements. So let's take a look at that. Next slide. During our last presentation, part 1, we shared this table which contains all the requirements found in Ed Code 43509 that identifies specific due dates and timelines. So expand on this, what we developed is the process checklist. So the next slide will share that piece. Here's our checklist, and it's 2 pages long. You can find this document, or you will see this document along with our other learning continuity plan resources posted to our LACO LCAP unit webpage. And so I'm going to review in the next few slides the contents of this document. This might be a little bit small font size on your computer screen. So we're just going to kind of take you through some of the key process related tasks in these next few slides. Next slide. Okay. So the beginning of the process is the part where many of you may have already have underway in your LEAs. These are the process tasks related to drafting your plan and engaging stakeholders in that process. So in addition to the consultation with required stakeholder groups, Ed Code 43509B1 and B2 requires LEAs to solicit recommendations from the public and to notify the public of the opportunity to submit written comments. So Ed Code specifically states that this does not require printed notices or mail. So what that could mean is that other modes of communication may be used, whether it be notification on a school or district website, recorded calls, email or text notifications, etc. And notifications should be sent in correspondence languages as per Ed Code 48985, which is known as that 15% rule, where a school with 15% or more of a primary language other than English, notifications shall be sent in those languages. The Ed Code also includes a requirement to include efforts to reach stakeholders without internet access or speak languages other than English. And so this applies not only to feedback solicited by members of the public, but also to the Parent Advisory Committee and English Learner Parent Advisory Committee requirements. And so ways that districts might demonstrate that effort in regards to this could include use of interpretation translation services, opportunities to provide feedback in a non-electronic manner, such as paper-based surveys, etc. So those are a couple processes that you might be engaged in right now as you are bringing stakeholders into the development of your plan. A couple notes in blue in that third Parent Advisory Committee bullet. They might be points of clarification. Charter schools are not required to present the plan to the Parent Advisory Committee or English Learner Parent Advisory Committee. Yet, please note that charter schools are still required to consult with parents, which is one of the required stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. The middle part of the checklist is about the 2 public meetings and submission of the plan. The key date that all LEAs are using to map out their timeline is the date of the board meeting prior to a September 30th due date for the learning continuity plan. So we have that little blue star marking that's the key date for backwards planning, and that's kind of how the new, how the process checklist works. There's a red font notating start here for planning your dates. So that's just a resource that you may consider using if you're trying to plot in some dates there for yourself. So prior to that board meeting where you'll be planning to adopt the plan, the LEA would need to have also one other meeting for the public hearing. And we've heard that some of you that could be happening as early as mid-August. In fact, I was just sharing with my team, flipping through the newspaper. I'm in Orange County though, but I saw one of our local districts here had their public notice posted in the OC Register. So I know that's happening quite early for some of you, depending on how many meetings that you have scheduled. So whether it's happening in mid-August or early September, you will have that public hearing in addition to the following meeting where you will have the adoption meeting. There is no requirement that these public meetings be regularly scheduled board meetings, Therefore, an LEA may choose to accomplish the public hearing and/or board approval of the plan at a special meeting scheduled off the regular board schedule, as long as the requirements for the 72 advance posting of the agenda, etc., are met. So then, not later than 5 days after your board approves your plan, the LEA will submit the plan to the county office. And since it is not specified, this will usually mean calendar days. So making a note that the latest this process step will usually occur, would be Monday, October 5th. For school districts and charter schools in the Los Angeles County area, they will be submitting that to LA County Office of Education through our LACO LCAP system. Next slide. And so for those of you in LA County, this is a screenshot of our system. And once you log in, you will see a tab for the Learning Continuity Plan where you'll upload a PDF copy of your plan. Next slide. Okay, so then the last part of the checklist is what happens after your plan is submitted to the county office. The county office, our team here at LACO, will have until October 30th to submit recommendations to the school district. Per Ed Code, charter schools are not included in the process of plan review and recommendations. If the school district will be receiving written recommendations, the school district will need to consider the recommendations at a public meeting of the governing board within 15 days. We will attempt to work with school districts to align the receipt of the recommendations with your scheduled board meetings if this is necessary. I know we had some questions about that, especially those of you who maybe only have one board meeting a month. The timing of that will be crucial for you. For this meeting, the review of the considerations, Ed Code does not specify whether the consideration of recommendations should be an action item, and therefore it could possibly be included as an information item with discussion. And the key here is that those recommendations are considered. So the decision as to whether it's an action item, information item, presentation, that will be a local decision. And lastly, the final approved plan needs to be posted on the homepage of the LEA's website. And this is a requirement for both school districts and charter schools. You will be wanting to post that final plan. If you do end up considering some of the recommendations and making changes, you'll post your final plan to your website. And that's the end of the process checklist. And we'll take it on to the next slide. So I'm just going to kind of kick off this next section. The Learning Continuity Plan will be going through reviewing each section by looking at the template, the key instructions regarding sufficient responses, as well as our checklist of legal requirements. In addition, we have included in some sections questions and answers that we thought might be helpful in providing some clarifications while your LEA is working on completing the Learning Continuity Plan. Next slide, please. My last slide here. First in the template, LEAs are asked to provide some general information. The focus here is to provide information that will provide some context for readers to better understand how the Learning Continuity Plan was developed, informed by the impact that the COVID-19 has had on the LEA and the community. We see this as two parts. So describing the impact on the LEA, your school, district, or charter school, but also what is the impact on the community? Many LEAs have administered surveys to assess needs of pupils and families. And so think about what might have been some of those key findings. How did that inform the development of your plans? So this is basically the introduction to your plan. Next, I'll turn it over to Adrienne, who will cover stakeholder engagement.
Good morning. The next section is stakeholder engagement, and research has shown that student and family engagement is one of the single most important factors in helping students succeed in school. And we saw with the local control funding formula and the LCAP, there was a renewed emphasis on families and educators working together as partners. And so with the Learning Continuity Plan, meaningful stakeholder engagement will allow for all stakeholders to have a deeper understanding of the current needs and possible solutions, and will also allow the LEA to make more informed decision-making and create a greater trust between the LEA and the stakeholders. So in the stakeholder engagement section, you will be addressing these 4 prompts. In prompt 1, it is here that you will describe the efforts made to solicit feedback of your plan from your stakeholders. Here you're going to be describing your overall process that you use to reach out to your students, to your families, the educators, and the community. In addition, you're going to be describing what the LEA did to assist the stakeholders that did not have internet access or speak a language other than English. In the first prompt, you're going to be also describing how the stakeholder engagement feedback was considered before finalizing your learning continuity plan. In prompt 2, you will be describing the options that you provided for remote participation, specifically in your public hearing and your public board meetings. In prompt 3, here you will be providing a summary of the feedback provided by each of the specific stakeholder groups. And in the last prompt 4, you will be providing your stakeholders as well as the public clear, specific information about how the stakeholder engagement process influenced the development of the learning continuity plan. And they say aspects, so keeping in mind that aspects may include specific actions or a specific section of your plan that may have been influenced by stakeholder input. In the checklist of legal requirements here, you will see specific requirements that not only are of what that must be addressed, but included in your continuity learning plan, but also the who. You will see the list of required stakeholder groups that must be included in your consultation for input and feedback. You will also see the specific requirements of the advisory committees, the PAC and the LPAC. And also for school districts, the requirement is superintendents presenting the learning continuity plan at separate advisory committee meetings for review and comment. And also note for that, the superintendent, the inclusion of the superintendent responding in writing to any comments from the PAC and LPAC. The next part of the checklist of legal requirements is in reference to the public hearing and board approval. This nicely lays out the various aspects of the legal requirements when holding the public hearing and the approval process of the learning continuity plan. Keeping in mind the public hearing must be held prior to the public meeting at which the learning continuity plan is adopted. And in this checklist, you will see the LEA's requirement of submitting the learning continuity plan not later than 5 days after adoption. So as stated before, we've embedded some of the questions that have been presented either to CDE through their FAQs as well as to our previous workshops. So the first question here is regarding advisory committees. Do the Parent Advisory Committee and English Learner Parent Advisory Committee need to be newly established committees, or may LEAs utilize committees convened in the prior school year? So we know that the LCFF statute and spending regulations establish the requirement for the composition requirements of the PAC and the LPAC, but it does not just address the length of time that members would serve on these two committees. So CDE says consideration should be on the consistency of what's in your bylaws. So you would want to follow that same process. You do not need to establish a new PAC or LPAC if your existing committees meet the composition requirements that are specified in the California Code of Regulations. The next question questions have come up regarding stakeholder engagement. Is there a minimum number of meetings an LEA must hold? So as Bonnie stated before, the learning continuity plan is intended to balance the needs of all stakeholders, which include educators, parents, students, and community members. And so the timeline is intended to allow for communication of the decisions that will guide how the instruction will occur during the 2021 school year. And so although there is not a minimum number of meetings that must be held, the question may be, how many meetings will be necessary to cover the required components of in-person instruction, distance learning, and all the other sections of the learning continuity plan, and also to provide the critical opportunities for your stakeholder engagement. The next question is, does the document require translation into other languages? And we know that there is no specific legal requirement for LEAs to translate the learning continuity in its entirety. This is a local decision. However, you may want to consider the needs of your community and provide options for accessibility to maintain transparency. Additionally, as stated before, the CDE is working on translating the template into 5 languages, and when they are available, they will be posted on CDE's Learning Continuity Plan webpage. Another few questions are regarding charter schools. So the first one is, are charter schools required to collect feedback from their ELAC, DLAC, and school site council members? And so the answer is no. While charter schools must consult with the required stakeholder groups, there is no specific requirement to collect feedback from your ELAC, DLAC, or school site council members. Parents, pupils, and staff members of these groups should be invited to engage in the general review of and comment on your plan as part of the requirements that are outlined in Ed Code. The next question for charter schools is, do charter schools also need to present the learning continuity plan to the PAC and LCAP? And here, as CDE states, no. Statute specifies that the superintendent of school districts and county superintendent of schools shall present the learning continuity plan to the PAC and LCAP as applicable for review and comment. So it does not specify for charter schools to comply with this requirement. The next slide has to do with stakeholder engagement timeline. And the question is, may an LEA consider input from stakeholders that was received prior to the development of the learning continuity plan to inform the actions and expenditures within the plan? So as we know, part of the stakeholder engagement process is to consult with parents, pupils, teachers, and so forth in the development of the learning continuity plan. So given that, prior to the COVID-19, many LEAs had begun the engagement process in developing their LCAP. But then as LEAs responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with school closures and then developed distance learning options, LEAs most likely continue to engage with the stakeholders to develop options to best meet the needs of community and its students as reflected in your written report to the community. So to answer this question, an LEA may consider input from previous stakeholder engagement or consultation activities, provided that it's to the extent that the prior engagement is consistent with the current requirements that are embedded in the development of the learning continuity plan. The next question is about public hearing and the opportunity to review. So it says, must the learning continuity plan be made available for public comment in advance of the public hearing, or just on the board agenda and posted in advance of the public hearing? So the answer is yes to both. The LEA is required to solicit comments from actions and proposed budget expenditures, as well as the public must have the opportunity to review the learning continuity plan prior to the public hearing. So remember, as stated, the agenda for the public hearing must be posted no less than 72 hours prior to the public hearing, along with the location where the learning continuity plan will be available for public inspection. The next slide is in regards to the board approval and whether it's a special meeting. And so we know that if the learning continuity plan must be adopted by September 30th, may the plan be adopted at a special board meeting, or must it be adopted at a regularly scheduled board meeting? So the answer is, the law states that the learning continuity plan must be adopted at a public board meeting, but statute does not state that the public hearing or the adoption must occur at a pre-scheduled board meeting. So therefore, if you do schedule a special public meeting outside of your pre-scheduled board meeting, this is fine. And the last question, can the learning continuity plan be a consent item when the governing board adopts the learning continuity plan? So CDE states to adopt the learning continuity plan as a consent item would be inconsistent with the intention of being transparent and stakeholder engagement in the development, review, and adoption of the learning continuity plan. So again, these are some common questions that have come up, and so we will address them throughout our presentation. And now moving on, Evan will explain in-person instructional offerings.
Thanks, Adrienne. Good morning, everyone. On this first slide, you'll see the single prompt from the template for in-person instructional offerings, as well as the table for entering specific actions, the allocated funding for these actions, and a cell to indicate whether this action is contributing to increased and improved services for unduplicated pupils. So that's from the template. You'll also see the instructions at the bottom of the slide that specify that an LEA's classroom-based instructional schedule should include plans and protocols to ensure safety of students and staff, including considerations for campus access, hygiene, protective equipment, et cetera. And notably, as we've mentioned before, much of this may already be defined in your LEA's COVID response and control plan that's required by the LA County Department of Public Health. So just to note that there are, again, other plans that you may be incorporating in your learning continuity plan. Note also in the instructions the emphasis of this section to identify students who've experienced significant learning loss to school closures in 1920. And then we obviously, since we're starting the year with the in a distance learning mode, we'll also be focused on this section on accelerating learning with the consideration that we're starting in distance learning, which is school closure. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll find the excerpt from our summary of legal requirements, which, although I noted in the Q&A, in case you didn't know, we didn't get this uploaded just yet. We'll get it uploaded later today, as well as send it out to you. So again, our summary of legal requirements merges both the prompt from the template as well as the notes from the instructions to kind of give you a quick go-to source. So as far as what's required in the plan, the description for LEAs must include the overall description of in-person instructional offerings, and specifically the actions the LA is going to take to offer classroom-based instruction whenever possible. It's not possible at the start of the year, but whenever it does become possible, and particularly for those pupils who experience significant learning loss due to school closures. But for both 1920 and the year moving forward as we're starting to distance learning. Also note, the LEAs must include in the table that accompanies this description any actions related to in-person instructional offerings, including description of the action, the total funds allocated for this action, and an indication of whether this action is contributing or not contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement. Next slide, please. So we did get one question. I think this may have been the only question in our survey for in-person instructional offerings. So the question was, how do we address the in-person instructional offerings when we are starting 100% virtual, as well as do we address the fact that we're on the watch list, which is the county watch list issued by the state, and do we address what we plan to do once we go hybrid and or 100% in person? And the answer is yes. Although LEAs in LA County will be starting the year with distance learning, they should indicate within the learning continuity plan how they offer in-person instruction and how they will transition to it should the conditions change that allow it. And this is consistent with the requirement of SB 98, which specified that LEA should offer in-person instruction whenever possible. Just remember, the learning continuity plan is intended to demonstrate how LEAs will ensure consistency and quality of instruction for students regardless of the methodology. Next slide, please. So here are the pages from the template where the LEA must address the distance learning plan, and like in-person instruction, the template aligns directly with the Ed Code from 43509. Note that there are 6 prompts for this section, so the description for distance learning is significantly more specific than that of in-person instruction. And you'll note also that there is a table at the bottom of the template for the distance learning section, in which LEAs are also to describe the specific actions related to distance learning, including how it contributes to increased or improved services, if it's applicable, the total expenditures, and the yes/no indicator. Next slide, please. This slide includes the directions for the template for the first 3 of the 6 prompts. So the continuity of instruction, access to devices, and connectivity, as well as pupil participation and progress. And we'll do a deeper dive in a minute. Next slide. And this slide includes the directions from the template for the 4th, 5th, and 6th prompt for distance learning, including the distance learning professional development, the staff roles and responsibilities, and supports for pupils with unique needs. And this category includes English learners, pupils with exceptional needs, which we've noted in the previous Q&A, that this is pupils with exceptional needs is defined in Ed Code as students identified by an individualized education program team as a child with a disability, just to clarify. Pupils in foster care and students who are experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. So our summary of legal requirements provides the following guidance to meet the legal requirements for this section, again, incorporating both the prompt and the instruction. So your plans for distance learning should include all of the following. How the LEA will provide continuity of instruction during the school year to ensure pupils have access to a full curriculum of substantially similar quality, regardless of the method of delivery. So notably for LA County schools and other counties on the state watch list, this description will describe how the distance learning with which they're beginning the school year is similar in quality to that of in-person instruction. The plan will address how the LEA plans for ensuring access to devices and connectivity for all pupils to support distance learning whenever it occurs. How the LEA will measure participation and assess pupil progress through live contacts and synchronous instructional minutes, as well as how the time value of pupil work will be measured. So for example, will the LEA calculation for time value be established by each individual teacher, or has the LEA established a grade or subject-specific team to establish time value based on a scope and sequence? What professional development and resources will be provided to staff to support the provision of distance learning, including the technological support? The extent to which the staff roles and responsibilities change because of COVID-19, what these new roles and responsibilities of the effective staff will be. For example, if you're having classified staff being utilized to monitor student participation in daily instruction, that's something you would note here. And then finally, what additional supports for pupils with unique needs will be provided, including those for English learners, pupils with exceptional needs, and pupils in foster care, and pupils who are experiencing homelessness during the period in which you're in distance learning. Also, LEAs must indicate in the table that accompanies this description any actions related to distance learning, both the description of the action and the total funds allocated for this action, as well as an indication of whether the action is contributing or not contributing to meeting increased or improved services. Next slide, please. So we had a few questions about distance learning, as well as some that we pulled from the state's FAQ for distance learning, which has been fairly recently updated. So we want to make sure everybody was aware of those additional updates. So the question is, how should schools track attendance? How should schools implement the use of weekly engagement records mentioned in SB 98? So first, I want to note that LACO Center for District Capacity Building is providing a series of webinars related to attendance and engagement, and we'll include a link to that in our follow-up Q&A. In one of the upcoming webinars they're using the SIS vendors who will be participating in breakouts for your LEA based on whichever vendor you use, because these vendors have created tools that they've developed to both monitor attendance and track participation in daily instruction. So these are the two distinct requirements. So just note that that's upcoming. We'll send the link out for that. But as far as the requirements, the requirement is daily participation is being used to track attendance and ensure the daily engagement in learning activities. However, documenting may be met through a variety of means: daily live interaction with a teacher or virtual assignments. And daily participation may also be documented through participation in online activities, completion of regular assignments, and contacts between employees of the LA, including those other than teachers. So it doesn't necessarily have to be for participation purposes. It could be an employee other than a teacher who engage with the student. Just in terms of the communication that goes out to the parents or the families of students, LEA should consider including the following in their local policy on how frequently to communicate with parents during distance learning: language of the parent, progress along the continuum of language development, access to the content, strategies to improve attendance and motivation, and information for parents to learn the virtual systems used by teachers, information for parents to understand home schedules and learning environments, social emotional effects from distance learning, and any additional strategies included in the learning continuity and attendance plan. Next slide, please. So this is a question that's risen several times. What is considered live interaction? I've utilized the CDE's FAQ response here. So EdCode requires that distance learning include daily live interaction. Daily live interaction is a two-way communication between a certificated employee and student each instructional day. So this does require a certificated employee participation, and it's recorded at the actual time of occurrence. Daily live interaction is required for every student with both the certificated employee and their student peers. In particular, English learners and students with special needs benefit from this daily oral language development opportunities. Examples include in-person and virtual communication or interactions, including but not limited to synchronous online instruction and phone calls where both parties communicate at the time of occurrence. One-way communication, including voicemails, emails, and print materials, is not considered live interaction. And pursuant to EdCode, if daily live interaction is not feasible as part of regular instruction, the governing board shall develop an alternative plan with parent and stakeholder input that would address frequent live interaction that provides a comparable level of service and school connectedness. Next slide, please. So there is a provision that allows for both distance learning and independent study. So the independent study has been a model, a program that's been around for years, and both are allowable. However, there have been some significant changes with regards to what's required for independent study. So just note that if you're offering independent study to meet to fulfill your students' needs in a remote learning situation, you'll be subject to an audit penalty if you don't meet the following requirements. So you have to address in-person instructional offerings. Sorry, lost my track there. Offer the required number of instructional days. You're going to have to document daily participation for each pupil for each school day on which distance learning is provided. So you'll notice that this is very substantially similar to distance learning. So essentially all the daily requirements for independent study will be the same as distance learning, so we don't have a disparity between the two. You'll also need to complete a weekly engagement record for each pupil documenting synchronous or asynchronous instruction. You'll have to document absences as required by EdCode for the purposes of chronic absentee tracking. And you'll have to develop written procedures for the tiered re-engagement strategies for students who are absent from distance learning for more than 3 school days. So note, this is independent study now. Previously, there was only a bi-weekly check-in required. So this is a substantial change to independent study. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I'm handing it off now to Rachel. Thanks.
Thank you, Evan. Hello, everyone. So the next section of the plan addresses pupil learning loss. And as you can see from the screenshot, there are 3 distinct prompts within the pupil learning loss section that must be addressed: pupil learning loss strategies, and the effectiveness of implemented pupil learning loss strategies. In addition, there's an actions table for actions to address pupil learning loss, which you can see at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. This slide shows the final instructions for the pupil learning loss section. And again, there are 3 distinct prompts within the pupil learning loss section. And the instructions provide guidance as to what a sufficient response is for each of the 3 prompts within the area of pupil learning loss. Also in the instructions, the CDE noted a resource that may be helpful to LEAs when responding to the 3rd prompt in this section. Next slide, please. Here is a screenshot of the pupil learning loss section from the checklist of legal requirements resource document. So for the first prompt included in this section, LEAs must describe how they will assess pupils to measure pupil learning status, particularly in the areas of English language arts, English language development, and mathematics. This description must include what tools and at what frequency the LEA will assess pupils to measure learning status within any instructional delivery model. For the second prompt that is included in this section, LEAs must describe the actions and strategies they will use to address learning loss and accelerate learning progress for pupils as needed. LEAs must also specify how these strategies differ for English learners, low-income students, foster youth, and individuals with exceptional needs, and students experiencing homelessness. The third prompt in this section asks LEAs to describe how the effectiveness of the services or supports provided to address learning loss will be measured. And as previously mentioned, there is an actions table for pupil learning loss in which LEAs must describe each action, provide the total amount of expenditures for each action, and indicate whether or not the action contributes to meeting the increased or improved services requirement. Next slide, please. The next area that must be addressed in the plan is mental health and social and emotional well-being. At the top of the slide is the screenshot of this section from the template, as well as the instructions for this section at the bottom of the slide. In the instructions, the CDE has also noted a resource that may be helpful to LEAs when completing this section. It's also important to note that there is not a table for actions and expenditures following this area, as there are with the previous 3 sections that were just reviewed. However, there is a table for any additional actions to implement the plan that follows the school nutrition section. Next slide, please. Here's a screenshot of the mental health and social and emotional well-being section from the checklist of legal requirements. When completing this section, there are 3 components of the prompt that LEAs must address. First, LEAs must describe how they will monitor and support the mental health and social and emotional well-being of both students and staff during the school year. Next, LEAs must describe the professional development that will be provided to staff to address trauma and other impacts of COVID-19. LEAs must also include a description of the resources that will be provided to staff and students to address trauma and other impacts of COVID-19 on the school community. Next slide, please. The next section of the plan is pupil engagement and outreach. Again, here you see a screenshot of this section from the template, as well as a screenshot of the final instructions. And please note that like the previous section, there is not a table for actions and expenditures following this section. Next slide, please. So here we see the screenshot of the pupil engagement and outreach section from the checklist of legal requirements. So for this area, LEAs must describe their student engagement and outreach process. In this description, LEAs must include their procedures for tiered re-engagement for students who are absent from distance learning. LEAs must also describe how they will provide outreach to students and their parents or guardians, including in languages other than English, when students are not meeting compulsory education requirements, or the LEA has determined that the student is not engaging in instruction and is at risk of learning loss. Next slide, please. The next section that LEAs must address is school nutrition. And as with the previous sections, you'll see the screenshot of the template at the top of the slide and the instructions at the bottom. And again, in the instructions, the CDE has noted a resource for LEAs to consider when responding to this prompt. Next slide, please. So here you'll see the section from the checklist of legal requirements. When responding to this section, LEAs must describe how they will provide meals for students who are eligible for free or reduced price meals for students participating in both in-person instruction and distance learning for each day of the school year. Next slide, please. The next section is additional actions to implement the learning continuity plan. And so on this slide, there's the screenshot of the additional actions table, as well as the final instructions at the bottom of the slide. Any additional actions to implement the plan may be included in this table. And this includes any actions and expenditures related to the mental health and social emotional well-being, pupil engagement and outreach, and school nutrition sections, since there is not an action table following each of these areas. You'll also notice that this actions table is slightly different from the actions table included in the template for in-person instruction, distance learning, and pupil learning loss, because this table includes an additional column to note the section of the learning continuity plan that the action is related to, such as mental health and social emotional well-being or school nutrition. The instructions also note that the LEA may put not applicable or NA in this column if the action does not apply to a specific section in the plan. In addition, LEAs must provide a description for each action, enter the total amount of expenditures for each action, and indicate whether or not the action contributes to meeting the increased or improved services requirement. Next slide, please. So one of the frequently asked questions is which funds must be included in the learning continuity plan. Per the FAQs from the CDE has indicated that the learning continuity plan shall describe how federal and state funding included in the revised budget adopted by the LEA is used to support actions described in the plan. And this includes learning loss mitigation funds. Also, as Bonnie mentioned earlier in the presentation, funds must be used according to their specific program requirements. Now I will turn it over to Jeannie for the increased and improved services section.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. For the increased or improved services section, per statute, the Learning Continuity Plan shall describe how the LEA will increase or improve services in proportion to the LCFF funding they receive, which is based on the number and concentration of their English learners, low income, and foster youth. And this section is pursuant to the spending regulations that address the use of this funding for these students. This section for increased or improved services in the CDE's template is similar to the section in the LCAP template. Here, the LEA identifies the percentage to increase or improve services, which reflects the amount of the increased apportionment based on the number and concentration of their low-income, EL, and foster youth enrollment, and the corresponding percentage reflecting the proportional increase in funding compared to funding that the LEA receives for all students. In this section, 2 prompts require descriptions that address specific components included in the Title V Code of Regulations, outlining the spending regulations for the increased supplemental and concentration grant apportionment. Next slide, please. For the first prompt, the LEA is required to provide a description addressing the LEA-wide or school-wide actions included in their learning continuity plan that are contributing to the requirement to increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils. The instructions for this prompt reference the spending regulations for the proportional increase in funding and specify how to explain actions being provided to an entire school or across an entire school district, how these actions are principally directed to and effected for the intended unduplicated student group. For these actions, the LEA needs to explain how the LEA considered the needs, conditions, and circumstances of the unduplicated pupil group as a result of COVID-19, how the action or aspects of the action, including, for example, how it's designed, the content included, the methods being used, or the location, how this information and the action is based on these considerations, and how the action is intended to meet the needs of the unduplicated students in response to COVID-19. The regulations require additional descriptions for school-wide and LEA-wide services where there are less than 40% school-wide or less than 55% school-wide. We have requested clarification from CDE on how this requirement may apply for these descriptions as applicable in this section. For the second response, the LEA is required to provide a description of how services for foster youth, EL, and low income are being increased or improved by the percentage calculated as compared to the services they're providing for all students. The instructions include that to improve services means to grow services in quality, and to increase services means to grow services in quantity. The instructions state that the description for this section applies to services marked in the Learning Continuity Plan as contributing to the increased or improved services requirement, and requires the LEA to explain any additional actions or services that contribute to meeting the increased or improved services requirement. Next slide, please. On this slide, we see a screenshot of the checklist for legal requirements. And you can see the components for each of the sections included, okay? Including the percentage, the dollar amount for the LCFF funds, the required descriptions in prompt 1, addressing LEA-wide or school-wide services and how these services are principally directed, including the 3 components required for those descriptions, and the requirements for prompt 2, addressing how the services overall increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils, and how these actions compare to what's being provided for all students. On the next slide, you'll see upcoming CDE webinars. For your reference, we will also be providing updates on additional information that's provided at these webinars. I think it may have been stated before that the CDE is continuing to update their FAQs. And at this time, if you have not already posted a question in the Q&A, you may do that, and we will follow up as always with responses to your question. And on behalf of the team, we look forward to working with you to support you with the development of your learning continuity and attendance plan. You can find our contact information on the next slide, and you're welcome to contact us at our LCAP address or at any of our individual email addresses. And at this point, we'll leave the presentation open for a few minutes if you need to still put a question in the Q&A section.